September 15, 1943. Monte Cervino Airfield, Salerno, Italy. Oberst Dietrich Peltz stood frozen, binoculars pressed against his face, watching something that violated every principle of military engineering he'd been taught. As a Luftwaffe staff officer temporarily attached to Kesselring's headquarters, he'd spent 2 decades studying airfield construction. He knew the timelines. He knew the requirements. He knew what was possible. And what he was seeing was impossible. His pencil scratched frantically across the observation log, but the words felt absurd even as he wrote them. 17 aircraft. Operating from a wheat field. The Americans had landed here 6 days ago. 6 days. In that time, German doctrine said they might have completed initial surveying work. Perhaps cleared some vegetation if they worked around the clock. Yet through the morning haze, he watched American C-47 transports landing and taking off with casual regularity. The runway gleamed in the Italian sun. Steel matting laid down like an enormous carpet across terrain German engineers had specifically marked as unsuitable for air operations without extensive preparation. Months of preparation. Peltz's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus. Yesterday this had been an empty field. Yesterday his reconnaissance photos showed nothing but wheat stubble and a few farm buildings. Now, fighters were taxiing into revetments that hadn't existed at sunrise. He looked down at his planning manual, the standard Wehrmacht reference for airfield construction. Minimum timeline, 6 weeks. That assumed ideal conditions, unlimited labor, no enemy interference and favorable terrain. The Americans were working under constant artillery fire. German bombers had struck this location twice in 3 days. The ground was soft from autumn rains. And they'd built a fully operational fighter base in 72 hours. Peltz closed the manual slowly. 27 German staff officers would be captured in the subsequent Allied advance through Italy. Every single one would report the same bewilderment, the same sense that they were fighting an enemy who'd somehow bypassed the fundamental laws of military engineering. What none of them knew, what Peltz couldn't possibly comprehend as he watched those impossible aircraft operations, was that this moment marked a turning point. Not in tactics. Not in courage or firepower or strategic genius. But in something far more fundamental. The Americans had industrialized warfare itself. They'd turned battlefield construction into a factory process, and the Wehrmacht was about to discover that all their tactical brilliance meant nothing against an enemy who could reshape geography overnight. The revelation had begun 4 days earlier when Allied forces stormed ashore at Salerno. Mixed among the first wave of landing craft were vehicles that German observers initially struggled to identify. General Major Rudolf Siakinius, commanding the 16th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, filed a report describing American trucks loaded with what appeared to be perforated steel sheets. Thousands of them stacked like oversized playing cards. His intelligence officers dismissed them as temporary road surfacing material. Perhaps the Americans were planning supply routes through muddy Italian terrain. It was a logical conclusion. It was also catastrophically wrong. They were witnessing the deployment of pierced steel planking, PSP, the innovation that would revolutionize warfare in ways no weapon system ever had. The genesis traced back to November 1941, an obscure airfield near Maxton, North Carolina. American engineers had accomplished something German planners considered a fairy tale. Constructing a 3,000-foot runway capable of handling heavy bombers in just 11 days. The secret was deceptively simple: interlocking steel mats. Each section measured 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, weighing 66 pounds. 87 holes punched through each mat reduced weight while maintaining structural strength. Simple. Portable. Revolutionary. German military attaches in Washington had actually reported on these experiments before America entered the war. Their dispatches described the testing program in detail. But in Berlin, these reports were filed under propaganda, dismissed as American exaggeration designed to intimidate potential enemies. The Germans had seen American industrial claims before. They'd watched Hollywood movies depicting American factories. They assumed it was all theatrical nonsense, the kind of boasting soft democracies used to compensate for lack of real military capability. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schultz of the Wehrmacht Engineering Corps would later write in his post-war analysis, "We believed Americans were soft. Their society's obsession with comfort and convenience made them incapable of the harsh improvisations war demanded. We could not conceive that this very trait, their intolerance for discomfort, would drive them to engineer comfort into the battlefield itself." The German mistake was philosophical, not tactical. They saw American creature comforts as weakness. They never imagined those comforts would become weapons. The first documented German encounter with American runway construction capabilities had occurred at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, though Wehrmacht High Command wouldn't grasp its significance for another year. Japanese reports reaching Berlin through diplomatic channels in late 1942 described American engineers repairing bomb-cratered runways in hours rather than days. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht dismissed these accounts as Tokyo's attempt to excuse their failures in the Solomons. General Alfred Jodl reportedly told his staff that the Japanese were seeing phantoms to explain their defeats. But the phantoms were real. The 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion had landed with the Marines at Guadalcanal in August 1942, inheriting a partially completed Japanese airstrip. Within days, despite nightly bombardment from Japanese warships and daily air raids, they transformed the facility into a base supporting continuous combat operations. The Japanese, whose own engineering doctrine allocated weeks for such work, watched in disbelief as American bulldozers working around the clock accomplished in hours what their manual labor achieved in days. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Kleist, captured at Salerno while commanding an artillery battery, spent hours interrogating his American captives about their engineering capabilities. He couldn't accept their explanations. In letters to his wife discovered decades later in American archives, he wrote, "They speak of laying runways as one might describe spreading a tablecloth. They have mechanized the impossible." The impossible was about to become routine. The true shock for German commanders wasn't the technology itself, it was the scale of American production behind it. Each steel mat required precise manufacturing to ensure perfect interlocking capability. The hooks and slots cut into each piece had to maintain tolerances of less than 1/16 of an inch. Any variation and the mats wouldn't lock together properly. Any weakness in the interlock and heavy bombers would tear the runway apart on landing. German industry, despite its reputation for precision engineering, struggled to maintain such standards while producing a few thousand aircraft parts monthly. They were fighting a war of scarcity, carefully rationing every ounce of steel, every hour of skilled labor. The Americans were producing 3 million square feet of PSP matting every month by mid-1943. Enough to build 10 heavy bomber bases. Every single month. Let that sink in. While German factories were measuring steel allocation in tons, carefully tracking every kilogram, American factories were churning out runway materials by the millions of square feet. At the Carnegie Illinois Steel Company alone, 5 production lines ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The steel arrived from mills in Pennsylvania, was pressed into shape by machines exerting 2,000 tons of pressure, punched with holes in a pattern developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and shipped to ports often before the paint had fully dried. Workers later recalled that the factory floor grew so hot from continuous operation that they had to rotate shifts every 2 hours to prevent heat exhaustion. The machines never stopped. Never. When one production line went down for maintenance, the others simply increased output to compensate. The logistical chain delivering these materials to combat zones defied German comprehension of what was possible. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, would later calculate that moving the materials for a single American airfield required more shipping capacity than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the Mediterranean. Yet the Americans built dozens of such fields simultaneously while maintaining their regular supply operations. Think about what that meant. Every steel mat had to be manufactured in America, loaded onto ships, transported across the Atlantic through U-boat-infested waters, unloaded at invasion beaches, moved inland through hostile territory and assembled under fire. The entire process, from Pennsylvania steel mill to Italian wheat field, often took less than 3 weeks. German supply chains couldn't move ammunition from France to Italy that fast. Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz, whose Kampfgruppe had fought the Allied landings in Sicily, documented his observations in a report that survived in Wehrmacht archives. His words captured the growing German realization that they were facing something beyond traditional military capability. Day 1. Americans clear vegetation with armored bulldozers impervious to sniper fire. Day 2. Ground leveled by machines working in darkness using lights we would never dare illuminate. Day 3. Steel matting arrives on endless truck convoys. Day 4. First fighters land. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is industrial conquest. Industrial conquest. Schmalz had stumbled onto the truth that would define the entire Western Front. The Americans weren't trying to defeat Germany through superior tactics or courage. They were burying German resistance under an avalanche of industrial production applied directly to the battlefield. The aviation engineers themselves represented a revolution in military thinking that German doctrine had never contemplated. By 1943, over 118,000 American troops were dedicated solely to airfield construction, organized into specialized battalions equipped with machinery that seemed fantastical to German observers. Each battalion possessed equipment worth more than an entire panzer company: D7 bulldozers that could move 20 tons of earth in minutes, graders that could level a field faster than 100 men with shovels, pneumatic drills that could break rock Wehrmacht pioneers would have had to blast, compaction equipment that could create surfaces harder than many paved roads. Sergeant Klaus Müller, a Wehrmacht pioneer captured in Sicily, watched American engineers work and later testified, "One American operator on a bulldozer accomplished more in an hour than my entire company could achieve in a week." But it wasn't just the machine, it was the systematic approach. They had a procedure for everything, time to the minute. While we were still surveying, they were already landing aircraft. The Americans had turned war into engineering. And they were very, very good at engineering. The 814th Engineer Aviation Battalion's operational history, captured intact when their headquarters was briefly overrun near Foggia, revealed the stunning pace of American operations. In 5 weeks in Sicily, they had constructed or repaired 13 airfields. They had removed 6,000 landmines without a single casualty using magnetic detection equipment German pioneers didn't know existed. They had laid 2.5 million square feet of PSP matting, graded 3 million cubic yards of earth, and constructed drainage systems that turned swamps into all-weather runways. German intelligence initially refused to believe these reports. Oberst Hermann Bulck, later to command a panzer division in France, reviewed the captured documents and declared them obviously fabricated for deception purposes. He calculated that such work would require at least 10,000 laborers working for 6 months. When informed that the American battalion consisted of fewer than 800 men, he accused his intelligence officers of incompetence. The systematic nature of American airfield construction particularly unsettled German observers. The process had been standardized to an astonishing degree. Site selection, surveying, clearing, grading, drainage installation, matting deployment, and facilities construction proceeded according to manuals that reduced complex engineering problems to simple checklists. A captured American technical manual, TM 5-255 Aviation Engineers, became required reading for German staff officers who struggled to comprehend its casual assumption that any piece of relatively flat ground could become an operational airfield within 72 hours. The process itself was almost mechanical in its efficiency. Hour 1. Reconnaissance teams identified suitable terrain using aerial photos and maps. Hour 3. Bulldozers began clearing vegetation, their armored cabs protecting operators from sniper fire. Hour 12. Graders leveled the ground while dump trucks brought in fill material for low spots. Hour 24. Drainage systems were installed, critical work that German engineers knew could take weeks. Hour 48. The steel matting arrived. This was where American efficiency became almost theatrical. Specialized trucks carried the mats stacked and ready. Crews worked in synchronized teams, one group positioning mats, another hammering the interlocking hooks into place, a third following behind to ensure proper alignment. They could lay 10,000 square feet per hour. A fighter strip required 750,000 square feet. Do the math. 75 hours of matting work. But the Americans worked multiple crews simultaneously, covering the runway in sections. What should have taken 3 days took 8 hours. Hour 72, aircraft were landing. Lieutenant General Freiherr von Senger und Etterlin, commanding the 14 Panzer Corps in Italy, observed American engineering operations from his headquarters overlooking the Rapido River Valley. He watched as the Americans built an entire complex of airfields in the valley below, despite German artillery positioned on the commanding heights. In his memoirs he wrote, "We could destroy their work each night, cratering runways, demolishing facilities. Each morning the damage was repaired before our pilots finished their breakfast. It was not a battle against an enemy, but against an industrial process that never stopped." The composition of aviation engineer battalions fascinated German intelligence officers who interrogated captured Americans. These units included not just construction workers, but specialists drawn from across American society. Civil engineers from state highway departments, equipment operators from mining companies, concrete specialists from dam projects, drainage experts from the Department of Agriculture. One battalion commander had previously managed the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. Another had built highways through the Rocky Mountains. These weren't soldiers playing at engineering, they were engineers temporarily wearing uniforms, bringing civilian expertise directly to the battlefield. Major Wilhelm Durr, a Luftwaffe base commander captured in southern France, spent weeks studying American airfield operations as a prisoner. His post-war analysis, written for the United States Air Force Historical Studies, noted, "We operated from concrete runways built by the TOT organization over months or years, or from grass fields developed over generations. The Americans brought their runways with them like a carpenter brings his tools. This was not an adaptation we could have made. It required an entire industrial philosophy we did not possess." The repair capabilities proved even more disturbing than the initial construction. German bombing raids, even when successful, achieved only temporary results. Luftwaffe technical officers calculated that a 500-kilogram bomb creating a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep should close a runway for at least 48 hours, assuming around-the-clock repair efforts. American engineers typically had such damage operational again in 4 to 6 hours. The secret lay not just in equipment but in preparation. Aviation engineer battalions carried stockpiles of PSP specifically for repairs. They prepositioned gravel, sand, and rapid-setting cement at strategic points around each airfield. They maintained bulldozers and graders on 24-hour standby. Most remarkably, they had standardized repair procedures to the point where crews could work in complete darkness, following memorized routines that allowed continuous operations despite German night attacks. Master Sergeant Antonio Benedetti of the 825th Engineer Aviation Battalion described the process in a letter home that was later published in Stars and Stripes. "Jerry drops his eggs at 2,300 hours. By 23:15 we're rolling. Dozers push the debris aside. Graders smooth the crater edges. Trucks dump fill. Compactors level it. We're laying mat by midnight. By 0200 the PSP is locked down and painted. By dawn, our fighters are taking off over the spot where Jerry's bomb hit. It's like a choreographed dance. Everyone knows their moves." The German Air Force, already struggling with fuel shortages and pilot losses, found itself facing an impossible equation. Every airfield they attacked was operational again before they could mount a follow-up raid. Meanwhile, new American fields appeared faster than German intelligence could update their target maps. A Luftwaffe planning document from October 1943 listed 17 Allied airfields in the Foggia complex. By the time German pilots received their briefings, 24 were operational with 7 more under construction. General der Panzertruppe Joachim Lemelson, whose troops faced American air power in Italy, wrote in a report to OKW, "The enemy's air superiority is not primarily a question of aircraft numbers or pilot skill, though both are considerable. It is a question of omnipresence. Wherever we concentrate forces, an American airfield appears within days. We cannot interdict their construction because they build faster than we can attack." During Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, American engineers outdid even their own previous achievements. The 852nd Engineer Aviation Battalion landed with the assault waves and had an emergency landing strip operational on D+1. By D+3, they had 2 fighter squadrons operating from French soil. By D+7, they had constructed 3 separate airfields, each capable of handling medium bombers. German commanders, who had expected at least 2 weeks before facing significant Allied air power, found themselves under continuous air attack from the second day of the invasion. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German Army Group G in southern France, reported to OKW, "The enemy's tactical air power multiplies daily. Each morning brings reconnaissance reports of new airstrips. Our movements, possible only at night, are restricted to a few kilometers before dawn reveals us to enemy fighters operating from fields that did not exist when darkness fell." The Germans were learning a bitter lesson. You cannot defeat an enemy who rebuilds faster than you can destroy. The cultural shock extended beyond mere technical capabilities. German military tradition emphasized permanence, solidity, and careful preparation. Luftwaffe bases featured concrete runways 2 feet thick, elaborate drainage systems, hardened hangars, and extensive support facilities. These installations, representing millions of man-hours and Reichsmarks, were strategic assets to be carefully defended. The American approach, temporary, flexible, almost disposable, represented a conceptual revolution German thinking could not accommodate. Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the famous Stuka pilot, observed American operations while briefly stationed in Italy before the German withdrawal. He later wrote, "We spent 2 years building our base at Foggia. The Americans rebuilt it completely in 2 weeks after we destroyed it. But they didn't rebuild it as we would, permanent, solid, traditional. They laid steel strips that could be pulled up and moved tomorrow. They erected 10 hangars that could disappear in hours. They created capability without commitment. It was warfare without weight." Hauptmann Wilhelm Schultz explained it this way in his post-war analysis. German engineering seeks perfection, the ideal solution that will stand forever. American engineering seeks adequacy, the quickest solution that will work today. In peace, our approach might be superior. In war, theirs proved devastating. While we were still calculating stress loads, they were landing aircraft. This philosophical difference reflected deeper disparities in how the two nations approached warfare itself. Germans saw war as an art form requiring mastery of eternal principles. Americans saw war as a problem requiring efficient solutions. Germans built monuments. Americans built tools. The psychological impact on German troops proved as significant as the tactical advantages. Lancer huddled in foxholes watched American fighters operate from runways built where they had fought days earlier. Tank crews saw their carefully camouflaged positions revealed by reconnaissance aircraft operating from strips that hadn't existed when they had dug in. Artillery observers found their targets defended by fighters scrambled from fields built overnight. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt, whose letters home were preserved by his family, wrote in November 1943, "The Americans are not fighting a war. They are building a civilization. Wherever they advance, airports appear, roads are paved, telephone lines strung. We destroy. They build. We retreat from positions we've held for months. They build airfields in places we held yesterday. How can we defeat an enemy who carries his own geography with him?" The innovation extended beyond the basic PSP matting. American engineers developed specialized equipment for every conceivable challenge. The Rome plow, a massive blade designed for clearing vegetation, could remove trees 18 inches in diameter while moving at 5 miles per hour. Specialized drilling equipment could create drainage wells through solid rock. Portable rock crushers could convert rubble from bombed buildings into runway-based material. Chemical soil stabilizers could turn sand into surfaces capable of supporting heavy bombers. Wehrmacht engineers, many of them skilled professionals before the war, found themselves reduced to manual labor while watching American teenagers operate machinery that transformed landscapes. A captured report from the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division noted with bewilderment that American boy soldiers, many appearing no older than 18, casually operated equipment worth more than entire German engineering companies possessed. The prefabrication revolution particularly stunned German observers. Entire airfield facilities arrived in numbered crates ready for assembly like gigantic construction toys. Control towers 40 feet tall were erected in 8 hours. Hangars covering 15,000 square feet were operational in 2 days. Fuel systems with underground tanks and miles of piping were installed in 72 hours. Operations centers complete with communications equipment were functioning within 24 hours of arrival. The Americans had turned warfare into an assembly line. And assembly lines were something Americans understood very, very well. The rapid construction capability fundamentally altered tactical possibilities in ways German commanders never fully adapted to counter. American commanders could establish forward fighter bases overnight, providing close air support at ranges previously impossible. They could shift the weight of air power along a front in days rather than weeks. Most devastatingly, they could afford to build airfields they might never use, creating uncertainty that forced German commanders to disperse their limited resources. General der Infanterie Gustav von Zangen, whose 15th Army faced American forces in Holland, described watching American C-47s land on a runway that his troops had defended 48 hours earlier. "My operations officer insisted the grid reference was wrong. There was no airfield at that location. I had to show him through my field glasses. The Americans had built it while we were writing our reports about holding the position." The strategic implications gradually became clear to German commanders, though too late to develop effective countermeasures. The American ability to project air power anywhere instantly meant that traditional concepts of front lines became meaningless. Every German position, no matter how far from established Allied bases, was potentially under immediate air threat. Reserves couldn't concentrate without inviting attack from fighters operating from runways that hadn't existed when the movement orders were issued. Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, issued a directive in May 1944 that revealed the Wehrmacht's growing desperation. Enemy airfield construction capabilities must be assumed to be unlimited. All planning must assume Allied tactical air support will be available within 72 hours of any landing or breakthrough. Traditional calculations of distance from enemy air bases are no longer valid. The directive was prophetic. After D-Day, American engineers performed even more spectacular feats. Advanced landing grounds sprouted across Normandy like mushrooms after rain. LG-1 near St. Miraglisse was operational on D+3. By D+10, 9 American airfields were operational in Normandy. By D+30 there were 24. German units found themselves under constant attack from aircraft based so close that pilots could make 4 or 5 sorties daily, returning to rearm and refuel in minutes. The mathematics of air superiority became overwhelming. A Luftwaffe pilot might fly 1 mission per day if he was lucky and fuel was available. An American pilot flew 4 or 5 missions from a base 10 miles behind the front lines. Captain Hermann Buchner, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer who compiled reports on American engineering capabilities, wrote a post-war analysis that survived in American archives. We were not defeated by American courage, though they had courage. We were not defeated by American weapons, though their weapons were excellent. We were defeated by American engineers who made geography irrelevant. They built their victory runway by runway across Europe. The pinnacle of American airfield construction efficiency came during the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945. The 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion crossed the Rhine at Remagen and had an emergency strip operational on the eastern bank within 18 hours. By the end of the second day, they were landing C-47s carrying supplies directly to the bridgehead. German commanders who had planned their defense assuming several days before Allied air power could effectively support the crossing found their positions untenable within hours. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, reported to his superiors, "The Americans bring their air force with them like artillery. Where they arrive in the morning, their aircraft operate by evening. We cannot move, cannot concentrate, cannot effectively resist. They have industrialized warfare beyond our comprehension." Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel, observing operations from Italy, made perhaps the most eloquent summary. "We spent 2 years preparing defensive positions based on terrain analysis and distance from enemy airfields. The Americans ignored terrain and created their own airfields wherever convenient. Every German tactical calculation became obsolete overnight, sometimes literally overnight. The omnipresence wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. German soldiers learned that nowhere was safe. No position was beyond air attack. No movement could go unobserved. The Americans had achieved something more devastating than air superiority, they had achieved air omnipresence. The speed of American construction created tactical opportunities that German doctrine had never anticipated and could never counter. During the breakout from Normandy, American commanders could order air support from fields that would be built after the orders were issued but before the attack commenced. Third Army's race across France was supported by airfields that advanced almost as fast as the ground troops, maintaining continuous close air support at ranges that should have been impossible. Colonel Hermann Zimmermann, operations officer for Luftflotte 3, reported in August 1944, "American fighter bombers operate at will, seemingly unlimited by range considerations. Our intelligence estimates of their capabilities based on known airfield locations are worthless. They build new fields faster than we can update our maps. We are fighting an enemy who reshapes geography to suit his tactical needs." The repair capabilities proved as decisive as initial construction. During the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders counted on winter weather to ground Allied aircraft and allow their offensive to proceed unmolested. They hadn't calculated that American engineers could clear snow from PSP runways in minutes using specialized equipment, while German fields with concrete runways remained unusable for days. The ability to maintain operations in weather that grounded the Luftwaffe provided a decisive advantage. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Unlike attacking permanent installations where damage accumulated over time, attacks on American fields seemed pointless. Young Luftwaffe pilots, already facing overwhelming numerical odds, lost motivation for missions that achieved nothing lasting. Veterans reported that squadron morale collapsed when intelligence showed targeted airfields operational within hours of successful attacks. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Messerschmitt Me-262 jet pilot, one of Germany's last hopes for air superiority, described his experience. "Our jets gave us a speed advantage that should have been decisive. But speed meant nothing when the enemy had airfields everywhere. We could outrun their fighters but not their geography. Every emergency landing field we might use was destroyed or captured. Every field they needed appeared overnight." By war's end, American aviation engineer battalions had constructed or reconstructed over 1,000 airfields across Europe and the Pacific. They had laid over 300 million square feet of PSP matting, enough to build a runway from Berlin to Moscow. They had moved 500 million cubic yards of earth, graded 50 million square yards of surface, and installed 10,000 miles of drainage pipe. They had accomplished in months what German military engineers calculated would require decades. The numbers told a story that no amount of German courage or tactical skill could overcome. In Normandy alone, from D-Day to the end of August 1944, American engineers built 31 complete airfields where none had existed. 31 operational bases in 90 days, each capable of supporting multiple squadrons, each with fuel storage, ammunition dumps, repair facilities, and living quarters. German defenders watched this transformation with growing horror. Positions they'd carefully prepared based on analysis of Allied air range became death traps as new airfields appeared behind their lines. Retreat routes planned to avoid air interdiction became killing zones when fighters operated from bases built during the retreat itself. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, signing Germany's surrender, reportedly told General Eisenhower, "We knew we would face American industry. We did not know we would face it directly on the battlefield in the form of engineers who could build faster than we could destroy." Eisenhower's reply, if accurately recorded, was telling, "That's why you lost." The American engineers hadn't just supported the war effort. They had become the war effort. Every airfield was a force multiplier. Every runway was a weapon. Every steel mat was a nail in the Wehrmacht's coffin. The men behind this revolution were as remarkable as the technology they deployed. Aviation engineer battalions drew from across American society, farm boys who knew how to operate heavy machinery, city workers who understood construction logistics, college-educated engineers who could solve problems on the fly, and foremen who could manage hundreds of men working under fire. These weren't traditional combat troops, yet they faced combat conditions daily. They worked under artillery fire, cleared minefields, operated within range of enemy snipers, and continued construction during air raids. German observers noted with grudging respect that American engineers never stopped working, regardless of danger. Sergeant Klaus Müller, a Wehrmacht pioneer captured in Sicily, watched American engineers work and provided testimony that revealed German bewilderment. "One American operator on a bulldozer accomplished more in an hour than my entire company could achieve in a week." But it wasn't just the machine, it was the systematic approach. They had a procedure for everything, time to the minute. While we were still surveying, they were already landing aircraft. The cultural differences manifested in unexpected ways. German engineers, trained in traditional military discipline, approached problems methodically, waiting for orders, following established procedures. American engineers improvised constantly. If a bulldozer broke down, they cannibalized parts from other equipment. If materials were delayed, they used whatever was available. If the manual said 6 hours, they found ways to do it in 3. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Zimmermann, a Luftwaffe logistics officer, calculated that establishing facilities using German methods would require 2,000 tons of concrete, 500 tons of steel reinforcement, 50,000 man-hours of skilled labor, and a minimum of 8 weeks under perfect conditions. He watched Americans achieve superior results with 100 tons of prefabricated materials, 50 men, and 72 hours. The respect German soldiers developed for American engineers was genuine, if grudging. These weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They weren't trying to kill Germans. They were simply building. Yet their construction work proved more devastating than any weapon. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt wrote in his preserved letters, "I can respect the American soldier who shoots at me. He is doing his duty as I do mine. But these engineers who build airfields under fire, who work through the night while we shell them, who return each morning to repair what we destroyed, they are something else entirely. They are not fighting us. They are simply working. And their work is burying us." The aviation engineers represented a uniquely American approach to warfare, solving problems through industrial efficiency rather than martial prowess. They didn't need to be the best soldiers. They just needed to be the best builders. And at building under fire, under pressure, under impossible circumstances, they had no equal. German veterans interviewed decades later consistently cited American engineering capabilities as the most psychologically devastating aspect of fighting the Western Allies. They could understand being outfought. They couldn't comprehend being outbuilt. The psychological impact on German forces cannot be overstated. Wehrmacht veterans interviewed decades after the war consistently cited American engineering capabilities as more demoralizing than combat losses. Combat they understood, it was part of military tradition, something German soldiers had trained for, something that made sense within their worldview. But watching the enemy reshape geography itself? That broke something fundamental in German military psychology. Feldwebel Karl Heinz, a veteran of both Eastern and Western fronts, explained the difference in a 1975 interview. "Against the Russians we fought battles. Against the Americans we fought factories. When we destroyed a Russian position, it stayed destroyed until they could bring up reserves. When we destroyed an American position, It was rebuilt before we could reload our guns. The Russians had courage in numbers. The Americans had bulldozers and steel matting. I feared the bulldozers more. The demoralization operated on multiple levels. First was the futility. Bombing American airfields achieved nothing permanent. Troops learned that their efforts, no matter how heroic, would be erased by morning. Second was the omnipresence. Nowhere was safe from air attack because airfields could appear anywhere. Third was the inevitability. German soldiers watched American industrial power manifest directly on the battlefield and understood they were fighting an unwinnable war. SS Oberfuhrer Paul Hauser, one of Germany's most decorated commanders, provided perhaps the most poignant epitaph for German military presumptions in a conversation with American interrogators. "You Americans kept saying you would win because you could outproduce us. We laughed, thinking you meant more tanks and planes. We didn't understand you meant you would produce the battlefield itself, that you would manufacture the very ground we fought on. You didn't defeat the Wehrmacht, you bypassed it, building your victory on runways that didn't exist when the battle started." The portable airfield technology reached its apotheosis in Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. American engineers jumped with the paratroopers, carrying lightweight aluminum planking designed specifically for rapid runway construction and airborne operations. Within 6 hours of landing, they had established landing zones for gliders carrying additional equipment. Within 12 hours, they had an operational airstrip capable of evacuating wounded and bringing in supplies. General der Fallschirmjäger Hermann Bernhard Ramke, Germany's most experienced paratrooper commander, watched American airborne engineers work and later admitted, "We invented airborne warfare, but the Americans perfected it. We could seize objectives. They could build bases. We could capture airfields. They could create them. They had industrialized even the most elite form of warfare." The final humiliation came during the occupation when German officers were required to attend American engineering demonstrations. They watched aviation engineer battalions construct complete airfields and exercises, accomplishing in hours what German doctrine stated required weeks. Veterans reported leaving these demonstrations in tears, finally understanding the totality of their miscalculation. Colonel Joachim Muncheberg, a fighter pilot with 135 victories, attended one such demonstration in 1946. He wrote to his wife, "Today I watched American engineers build in 4 hours what we could not build in 4 weeks. I finally understand why we lost. We brought warriors to an industrial competition. We thought courage and skill would triumph over material superiority. We did not comprehend that they would make material superiority so overwhelming that our courage became irrelevant." The revolution in military engineering that American aviation engineers represented fundamentally changed warfare. The ability to create air superiority anywhere instantly through engineering rather than combat rendered traditional military geography obsolete. Distance from bases, terrain obstacles, and seasonal conditions, factors that had governed military operations throughout history, became minor variables in American planning. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored warfare, made a final assessment that captured the existential shock to German military thinking. "We perfected mobile warfare, the blitzkrieg that conquered Europe. But the Americans achieved something greater: mobile infrastructure. They didn't just move armies quickly. They moved civilization itself. They brought their entire industrial base to the battlefield, assembled it under fire, and operated it in combat. We were still fighting the last war while they were inventing the next one." The strategic implications extended beyond World War II. Modern warfare assumes rapid airfield construction, forward-based development, and expeditionary engineering as fundamental capabilities. The revolution that shocked German generals in 1943 has become so routine that modern military officers cannot imagine warfare without it. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, reflecting on the Italian campaign, made perhaps the most eloquent summary of German bewilderment. "We were the inheritors of Clausewitz and Moltke, masters of operational art, students of 2,000 years of European warfare. We knew how to fight in every terrain, under every condition, against every enemy. But the Americans did not fight terrain, they transformed it. They did not accept conditions, they created new ones. They did not defeat us in battle. They built their victory piece by piece, runway by runway, until our expertise became irrelevant and our experience worthless." The contrast with German methods became increasingly stark as the war progressed. The Luftwaffe's own construction units, the Luftwaffe Bautruppen, operated with methods essentially unchanged since World War I. They relied heavily on manual labor, often using forced workers and prisoners of war. A typical German airfield construction project in 1944 might employ 5,000 workers for 3 months to achieve what an American aviation engineer battalion could accomplish with 800 men in 3 days. Professor Heinrich Focke, designer of the Focke-Wulf aircraft, visited American-constructed airfields after his capture and wrote, "German engineering seeks perfection, the ideal solution that will stand forever. American engineering seeks adequacy, the quickest solution that will work today. In peace our approach might be superior. In war theirs proved devastating. While we were still calculating stress loads they were landing aircraft. The legacy endures in military doctrine worldwide." NATO planning during the 1950s saw former Wehrmacht officers interrupt discussions of Soviet capabilities to ask about airfield construction capacity, traumatized by their experience of American engineering overwhelming traditional military calculations. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his memoirs, "We prepared for every contingency except one, that the enemy would simply build his way to victory. The Americans treated Europe like a construction site, and they had the tools to reshape it according to their needs. Our finest tactical minds were defeated by American bulldozers and prefabricated materials. The transformation was complete. Warfare would never be the same."